The wind came first as it always did in Wyoming, ahead of everything else that mattered. It came down off the Laramie Range in long invisible blades that carved the last warmth out of the air, and left the valley floor stripped bare, shivering under a sky so blue it looked brittle enough to crack. This was the autumn of 1886, and the wind was not a season, it was a sentence. Each gust that tore through the cottonwoods along Dryer Creek carried a particular arithmetic with it, a subtraction of hours, a narrowing of the margin between a world that could be worked and one that could only be endured. Other settlers heard the wind as weather. Maren Calloway heard it as a clock, and the clock was running out. She was dragging a sack of raw fleece across her yard when the first hard gust of October hit her broadside. The sack was enormous. A shapeless mass of greasy, unwashed wool that weighed nearly as much as she did, cinched at the top, with a length of hemp rope that had already cut a raw groove into her palms. She did not stop. She leaned into the wind the way a draft horse leans into a harness, her boots digging shallow trenches in the frost-hardened dirt. Her jaw set against the effort and the cold and the absurdity of what she must have looked like to anyone passing by. No one was passing by, but if they had been, they would have seen a woman of 34, lean and angular, with sun-darkened hands and a face that had been scoured of any softness by 14 months of solitary labor, hauling a filthy bag of sheep's wool through the narrow doorway of a house that was more burrow than building. The soddy sat against the gentle slope of a low hill, like something the earth had partially swallowed and then forgotten about. Its walls were packed sod nearly 2 feet thick, cut from the prairie in dense root-laced bricks, and stacked with the grim patience that the territory demanded of anyone foolish or brave enough to claim a piece of it. The roof was timber, and more sod sprouting a thin, stubborn crop of dead grass that gave the whole structure the appearance of a small sleeping animal. Ewan Calloway had dug the foundation himself during their first spring on the claim, 4 years ago. He had stood waist-deep in the trench shirt soaked through, grinning up at her with the particular reckless joy of a man building something from nothing. He had been dead for 14 months. Maren did not think about the grin. She thought about the doorway which Ewan had framed wider than most, and the door itself which he had hung on the inside of the frame so that it swung inward. She had questioned the design at the time. Every other door in the settlement swung outward to save space in the cramped interiors. Ewan had simply shaken his head, his expression carrying that quiet certainty she had learned never to argue with, and said that a door that swings inward is a door that snow cannot seal shut. She had filed the information away without fully understanding it, the way she had filed away so many of his observations, a vast and unorganized library of practical knowledge that she was only now in his absence beginning to catalogue and comprehend. She wrestled the sack through the doorway and dropped it on the packed earth floor with a heavy, greasy thud. The smell hit her immediately, rich and pungent, a raw animal scent layered with the sharp, almost chemical tang of lanolin. It was the smell of a living flock compressed into dead fiber, an olfactory assault that clung to everything it touched. She breathed it in without complaint. She had smelled worse in 14 months of surviving alone. She had smelled the particular sweetness of infected flesh. During the 9 days it took Ewan to die, a smell that had settled into the walls of this very room and taken weeks to fade. And against that memory, the honest stink of sheep's wool was practically perfume. The room she stood in was changing. It had been changing for weeks, slowly losing its identity as a dwelling and acquiring the dense, layered quality of something else entirely, something that did not yet have a name. Against the north wall, stacked from floor to within a foot of the sod ceiling, was a solid mass of split firewood. Cottonwood, mostly pale and fibrous, interspersed with the denser, resinous cuts of lodgepole pine she had scavenged from a deadfall 2 miles up the creek. The logs were fitted together with the precision of dry stone masonry, their split faces turned inward, their bark-covered backs pressed against the rough planking she had nailed to the wall. The west wall was half done, the wood rising to chest height, the remaining space above it revealing the crude cavity she had created between the plank lining and the original sod. It was into this cavity that the wool would go. She had already packed the north wall's cavity full. The process was invisible from inside the room, now hidden behind the wood. But she knew it was there. A dense layer of raw, unwashed fleece compressed into every inch of the gap. Its greasy fibers interlocked and tamped tight with a long pole until the space was solid with trapped, unmoving air. The lanolin that saturated each fiber was the key, or one of the keys. It was a natural wax hydrophobic, a substance that she produced to waterproof their own coats. It would not absorb the moisture that seeped through the porous sod. It would repel it, keeping the wool dry and the trapped air still. Still air. That was the phrase Ewan had used, and it lived in her mind now, like a psalm, a fundamental truth around which her entire desperate enterprise was organized. She remembered the evening he had taught her. Not the full lesson which had unfolded over years of small observations and quiet demonstrations, but the single moment that had crystallized everything. They had been sitting in this room at the small table that now stood shoved against the diminishing center space, and he had held up a clump of raw fleece in the lamplight. The light had caught the individual fibers, each one crimped and kinked, creating thousands of tiny pockets within the tangled mass. His voice had been low, unhurried, the voice of a man explaining something he considered so obvious it barely required words. It is not the fiber that holds the warmth. It is the air trapped between the fibers. Each little crimp holds a pocket of air, and the lanolin, the grease, keeps that air from moving. Still air is the finest blanket there is. He had let the fleece drop back to the table and picked up his coffee, the lesson delivered with the casual finality of a man who had learned it not from a book, but from a lifetime of watching animals survive conditions that killed unprepared men. His formal schooling had ended before his 12th birthday, but the education he carried was deeper than anything a classroom could provide. It was the accumulated intelligence of generations of shepherds in the Green Mountains of Vermont, men who had kept their flocks alive through winters that buried fences and froze rivers. Solid men who understood that survival was not about fighting the cold, but about understanding its mechanics. Maren knelt beside the sack of fleece and began to tear it open. The wool inside was matted and filthy, clumped with dried mud and burrs and the particular dark grease that collected along a sheep's belly. She pulled out a handful and worked it between her fingers, feeling the lanolin coat her skin thick and waxy. She had traded Ewan's shepherding tools for this wool. His shearing scissors, his crook, his marking iron. The specialized equipment of his former trade that she had no use for and no skill to operate. They were his tools, not hers. Her tools were different. They hung on a rack by the door, heavy and angular. The unmistakable instruments of a blacksmith shop. A cross-peen hammer with a short hickory handle worn smooth by decades of use. A set of tongs, a small pry bar, a cold chisel. They had belonged to her father, Silas Pardee, who had run a forge in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and who had put a hammer in her hand before she was old enough to lift it properly. She had grown up to the rhythm of iron on iron, the heat of the furnace, the precise violence of shaping metal. She knew how to drive a nail. She knew how to swing a hammer with economy and force. She knew the difference between a tool and a weapon, which was nothing more than a matter of intent. These skills inherited from her father were the reason she could do what she was doing. She had nailed the rough planks to the interior walls herself, driving sharpened wooden pegs deep into the dense sod first, then securing the salvaged lumber to them with square-cut nails. The planks had come from a collapsed shed a mile down Dryer Creek, each one pried loose with her father's bar and carried back on her shoulder in a procession of solitary trips that had taken the better part of a week. It was brutal, monotonous work, the kind that emptied the mind and filled the body with a deep, aching fatigue. But with each plank fixed in place, the cavity between wood and sod took shape, and the cavity was the architecture of her survival. A narrow space of still air sealed with greasy wool standing between her and the killing breath of a Wyoming winter. She was stuffing the west wall's cavity now, reaching through the gap above the firewood, with one hand feeding clumps of wool in and tamping them down with the pole. The smell intensified with each handful, and the room, already dim and compressed, seemed to shrink further around her, the walls of stacked wood closing in like the sides of a coffin. She shoved that thought away. It did not belong to her. It belonged to Prudence Holt, who had not yet said it, but who would, and when she did, it would land with the particular accuracy of cruelty disguised as concern. For now Maren was alone with her work, and the work was a kind of prayer. Each clump of wool pressed into the wall was an act of faith in a principle she could not see but believed to be true. She did not fully understand the science of it, not in the language of textbooks or the formulas of engineers. She understood it in the language Ewan had spoken, the language of observation and analogy of sheep standing with their backs to the wind and snow insulating the roots of dormant grass. She understood that the enemy was not cold. The enemy was the movement of air that carried heat away from a warm body, whether that body was a sheep or a woman or a house. And she understood that the answer was not to generate more heat, which was the brute force approach every other settler in the valley relied upon. Roaring fires and mountains of fuel burned through the long dark months. The answer was to prevent the heat she already had from escaping, to make the air stand still. The distinction was simple. Executing it was not. Jedediah Holt reined in his horse at the edge of her yard on an afternoon in mid-October, when the wind had a particular malice to it, a horizontal sleet of cold air that drove grit into the eyes and made every exposed surface ache. He sat in the saddle for a long time, watching her through the doorway as she maneuvered a heavy log across the threshold, her movements tight and efficient, stripped of any wasted motion. He was a man of perhaps 55, thick through the shoulders and neck, with a face that had been weathered into a permanent expression of guarded appraisal. 20 years in the valley had taught him what worked and what did not, and what Maren Calloway was doing fell so far outside the boundary of what worked that it troubled him in a way he could not quite articulate. He dismounted. His boots hit the frozen ground with a solid crunch. He walked to the doorway and looked inside, and what he saw deepened the crease between his eyes. The north wall was gone, replaced by a solid face of stacked timber. The west wall was going the same way. The room which he remembered as small but functional, the room where he had sat with Maren Calloway and discussed the price of hay, was now a compressed corridor, the living space squeezed into a narrow channel between towering walls of wood. The smell of lanolin and raw wool hung in the air like a physical substance. His chest tightened, and the words came out slow measured. The way he spoke when he was trying to be patient with something he considered foolish. "Maren, what is it you're about here?" It was not a question. It was an expression of bewilderment dressed in the syntax of concern. She paused in her work, wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a dark smear of dirt and lanolin. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly, without deference, an expression that Jedediah found unsettling in a woman and would never have admitted it. "A body stacks their wood outside," he continued, gesturing at the towering mass behind her. "You bring a spark in here, this whole place goes up. And the wool in the walls, the damp will get in, it'll rot, you'll have vermin." He ticked off the objections with the confidence of a man who believed he was stating natural law. Her answer was the same one she had given before, the only one she had delivered in a voice that was even and patient, and carried no expectation of being understood. "The wood is for holding the heat, Mr. Holt, not just for making it. It has mass. It will drink the warmth from the stove and hold it long after the fire is out." She gestured to the exposed cavity where a tuft of greasy wool was visible between two planks. "And the wool, it is the grease that matters. Lanolin sheds water. It will not rot. It holds the air still. It is the still air that keeps the warm in and the cold out." Jedediah processed this the way a stone wall processes rain. The words struck the surface and ran off without penetrating. He understood fire. He understood thick walls. He understood the fundamental equation of winter survival as it had been practiced for 20 years in this valley. Build a big fire, keep it burning, endure. The idea that wood could serve a purpose other than burning, that it could function as a kind of reservoir for heat absorbing warmth slowly and releasing it gradually. This was a concept that required a step of abstraction. His practical mind was not equipped to take. It was not stupidity. It was the limitation of a worldview built entirely on precedent. He had never seen it done. Therefore, it could not work. He shook his head, a slow, heavy gesture that carried more sorrow than dismissal. A big fire is what a body needs, Maren. A big fire and thick walls. You're making your house smaller and filling it with kindling and sheep stink. He turned to go, then stopped. The wind gusted between them, carrying the scent of ice and the faint distant smell of wood smoke from his own chimney half a mile to the east. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, taken on a different quality, something harder and more deliberate, the voice of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. This land has good water. That creek doesn't dry up, not even in August. It's a valuable piece of ground, Maren, and it needs someone who can carry the weight of it. He let the sentence hang in the cold air, unfinished but complete. If you change your mind, I'll pay a fair price. He had said this before, not 3 months after Ewan's burial, when the dirt on the grave was still raw and loose. She had refused then with a single word, and the word had been enough. But this time something in the way he delivered it was different. There was no urgency, no pressure. There was patience. The particular, unhurried patience of a man who was not making an offer, but placing a bet. A man who believed that the outcome was already determined and that he simply needed to wait for the inevitable to unfold. She would fail, the winter would break her, and he would be their fair price in hand when the breaking was complete. Maren felt the calculation behind his words the way she felt the wind as a force with direction and intent. She did not respond. She watched him mount his horse, watched him ride east into the slanting light. And she understood with a cold crystalline clarity that Jedediah Holt was not her neighbor. He was her adversary. He had been her adversary since the moment Ewan's heart stopped beating. And the only thing that had changed was that he had now allowed her to see it. She went back inside and picked up the next log. The gossip traveled faster than the wind. Prudence Holt, Jedediah's wife, was a woman of sharp features and sharper opinions, a person for whom the act of judgment was as natural and necessary as breathing. She did not dislike Maren. She did not know Maren well enough to dislike her. What she knew was the story, and the story was irresistible. The widow Calloway was filling her house with firewood, not stacking it outside like a sane person, but piling it inside floor to ceiling, until her living space was barely wide enough to turn around in. And the wool, Lord have mercy, the raw, unwashed, stinking wool she was cramming into the walls, like a woman stuffing a mattress. The house smelled like a shearing shed in July. Maren Calloway had lost her husband, and now she was losing her mind. And wasn't it a pity, wasn't it a shame? Someone really ought to do something, though no one could say exactly what. The story grew with each telling, as stories do. By the time it had made the rounds of the settlement, passing from hearth to hearth, in the amber glow of evening fires, it had acquired the density and weight of established fact. The wood was not just inside the house, it was blocking the door. The wool was not just in the walls, it was on the floor, on the bed, everywhere, and the smell could be detected from 50 yards away. The details shifted and multiplied, but the conclusion remained constant, delivered with the particular satisfaction that comes from watching someone else's misfortune confirm one's own good sense. Poor soul, she's gone. Amusement was easier than understanding. Pity was a more comfortable position than curiosity. The settlement was not cruel. It was simply certain that the accumulated wisdom of 20 years of survival in this valley was sufficient certain that a woman alone could not improve upon the methods that strong men had established. Certain that deviation from the norm was evidence not of innovation, but of collapse. They wrapped Maren in the soft shroud of their sympathy and closed the lid, and the matter was settled. All except in one household. Ada Dunmore lived 3 miles to the northwest in a cabin her husband had built from hand-hewn logs in the years before the railroad brought milled lumber to the territory. The cabin was solid, well-chinked and unremarkable, the home of a woman who kept her own counsel and expected the world to do the same. Her husband, Garrett Dunmore, had been a trapper, one of the last of his kind. A man who had spent the better part of 3 decades moving through the high country of the Rocky Mountains, setting his lines along frozen streams, and living for months at a time in shelters he built from whatever the landscape provided. He had learned his survival from the men who came before him, the old-timers and mountain veterans who had mapped the passes and named the peaks, men who understood that the wilderness was not an enemy to be conquered, but a system to be read. Garrett had been dead for 6 years, taken by a fever that no amount of wilderness knowledge could cure. And Ada had lived alone since then, a quiet, watchful woman of about 60, whose eyes missed very little and whose mouth offered even less. She had heard the gossip about Maren, of course. In a settlement this small, hearing the gossip was as unavoidable as hearing the wind. But where others heard a story of decline, Ada heard something else, a faint familiar chord that resonated with memories of her own. Garrett had done things that looked strange to outsiders. He had packed the gaps between the logs of their cabin with a mixture of mud, pine pitch, and animal fat that the neighbors had found bizarre and slightly revolting. He had oriented the cabin's single window to the south and its heavy log wall to the north, a design choice that seemed arbitrary until you lived through a winter in it and realized that the south-facing glass caught every available hour of weak winter sunlight, while the dense north wall absorbed the brunt of the wind without transmitting its chill. He had learned these things from men who had learned them from men who had learned them from the land itself. And the learning had always looked peculiar from the outside because it was not based on tradition, but on observation. Ida rode past Maren's soddy one morning in late October, her horse picking its way carefully along the frozen ruts of the track. She saw Maren outside splitting a log with a heavy maul, the steel head rising and falling with a rhythm that spoke of long practice. Ada reined in, but she did not dismount. She sat in the saddle and watched her face, unreadable, her eyes tracking the movement of the maul, and the precise way Maren positioned each log on the chopping block, turned it to find the grain and split it clean with a single stroke. The technique was not a farmer's technique. It was something older, more deliberate, the controlled economy of someone who had been taught to read the material before striking it. Maren felt the gaze and looked up. Their eyes met across the yard. Ada offered a single slow nod, a gesture that contained no judgment, no pity, no advice. It was a question without words, an acknowledgement that something was happening here that she did not fully understand, but was not prepared to dismiss. Then she nudged her horse forward and rode on, and the moment was over. But Maren held on to that nod the way a drowning person holds onto a plank. It was the only response she had received that did not carry the weight of condescension. The only indication that somewhere in this valley there existed a mind willing to consider the possibility that she was not insane. It was not agreement. It was not support. It was the simple, radical act of withholding judgment. And in the calcified certainty of the settlement's opinion, it was the most valuable gift anyone could have given her. The skepticism of the community was a force like the wind, a constant pressure that had to be acknowledged, endured, and ultimately disregarded in the execution of her work. She did not need anyone to believe in her. She needed only for the principle to be sound. And the principle was sound. She was certain of this, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, deeper than memory, all the way down to the bedrock of her grief. Because the principle was not hers, it was Ewan's. And Ewan had never been wrong about the physical world. He had been wrong about many things, about the richness of Wyoming soil, about the friendliness of the cattle ranchers to sheepmen, about his own invulnerability to the random violence of a frightened horse. But about the behavior of heat and cold, about the movement of air, and the properties of the materials that could control it. He had possessed a knowledge so deep and intuitive that it seemed to Maren less like learning and more like a form of communion with the world itself. She thought about this at night, lying in the narrowing corridor of her living space, the walls of wood close enough to touch, on either side the smell of lanolin thick in the darkness. She thought about Ewan, and when she thought about Ewan, she did not think about the grin or the laugh, or the way his hand felt on the small of her back when they walked together along the creek in the evening light. She thought about the last 9 days. The horse had thrown him against the fence post on a Tuesday afternoon in August. She had heard the sound from inside the house, a sharp concussive crack that was not the sound of wood breaking, but of something worse, something denser and more final. She had found him on the ground, conscious, his face white, his breathing shallow and wrong. 2 ribs broken, maybe 3, the sharp ends pressing inward against things that were never meant to be pressed. He had smiled at her that same reckless grin and told her it was nothing. He'd had worse, he'd be up in a day. She had believed him because she needed to, and because he was Ewan, and Ewan did not break. By the 3rd day, the fever had arrived. By the 5th, it owned him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body burning from the inside, the infection spreading through the damaged tissue like fire through dry grass. On the 5th night, he had called out the names of sheep one by one in a voice that was high and thin and lost the voice of a boy on a hillside in Vermont, counting his flock in the falling dark. Clover, Bess, Old Molly. The names came in an unbroken stream, each one distinct, each one spoken with the tender precision of a man who had known every animal in his care by name and temperament, and the particular way it moved through the world. Maren had sat beside him and listened, her hand on his burning forehead, and understood that he was no longer in Wyoming. He was somewhere green and far away, somewhere the wind did not carry ice, and he was counting his sheep, because that was what you did when the world was ending. You went back to the beginning, and you counted what you loved. On the 7th day, he had surfaced. His eyes had cleared briefly, and he had looked at her with a focused intensity that cut through the fog of fever and pain, and found her the real her, the woman he had married and brought west and built a house with. His hand had found hers, and his grip had been surprisingly strong. The grip of a man transmitting something urgent across a rapidly widening distance. His voice cracked as the words pushed through, "Remember the still air, Maren." She had thought he was delirious, another fragment of the fever's architecture, a piece of some internal monologue that had briefly found its way to his lips. She had smoothed his hair and told him to rest, and he had closed his eyes. And 2 days later, he was dead. And she had dug his grave herself, alone in soil that fought the shovel at every inch. And she had lowered him into it, wrapped in a wool blanket, because she could not afford a coffin. And she had filled the hole and tamped it flat and stood over it in the August heat, and felt the wind begin its long, slow countdown toward the winter that was now pressing against the walls of her house. Remember the still air. She understood now. It was not delirium. It was instruction. The last and most important thing he had to teach her, compressed into 4 words by a mind that knew it was running out of time. He was not talking about physics. He was talking about survival, her survival. He had seen the winter coming from the far side of death, and had used his last clear moment to hand her the key. Every log she carried, every clump of wool she packed into the walls, every nail she drove, every plank she fitted, every hour of exhausting solitary labor that turned her home from a shelter into something the valley had never seen. It was all in service of those 4 words. The work was not just construction. It was a continuation of a conversation that death had interrupted but not ended. She was building his idea with her hands, and in doing so she was keeping him alive in the only way that mattered, not as a memory, but as a principle made manifest in wood and wool and the still trapped air between them. She did not share this with anyone. It was not the kind of thing that could be shared. It belonged to the small private space between grief and purpose, the space where the dead continued to speak if you knew how to listen. The days shortened, the work continued, and then on a cold morning in early November, Ada Dunmore appeared at her door. Ida did not knock. She simply stood in the doorway holding a small clay jar sealed with a wax plug, her face betraying nothing beyond the mild, habitual patience of a woman who had spent most of her life waiting for men to finish talking so that the actual work could begin. Maren looked up from the west wall cavity, a clump of fleece in her hand, and waited. Ada held out the jar. Maren took it, pulled the wax plug, and smelled it. Animal fat, dense and sharp, with a faintly rancid undertone. Bear grease. Ada's voice was low and unhurried, as spare as the rest of her. My husband used to pack this into the joints between the logs. The old-timers in the high country taught him. Seals out water, seals out wind. It was not advice. It was not instruction. It was recognition. The offering of one tradition to another. The mountain trapper's knowledge meeting the shepherd's knowledge across the gap of a clay jar. Ada was telling Maren, without saying so directly, that she had seen this principle before, dressed in different materials and applied by different hands, and that she understood it was not madness, it was method. Maren felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had not realized she was carrying. She nodded and set the jar on the table beside her other supplies. Ada did not leave. She stood for a moment, her eyes moving over the room, taking in the stacked wood, the packed cavities, the compressed living space. Then her gaze returned to Maren, and her voice dropped to a register that was almost private, almost reluctant, the voice of a woman sharing information she was not sure she had the right to share. Jedediah Holt rode to Cheyenne last month. He was at the land office. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The sentence was a key that unlocked a door Maren had suspected existed but had not been willing to open. The Homestead Act was clear. A claimant had to demonstrate continuous residence and improvement of the land. Failure to do so or a successful challenge by another party could result in the claim being vacated and the land reopened for filing. Jedediah's land bordered hers to the east. The creek that watered both properties entered his land from hers. He had wanted that water since before Ewan died, and now Ewan was dead, and Maren was a woman alone, and the winter was coming, and women alone did not survive winters in Wyoming. This was the calculus Jedediah had performed, and the answer he had arrived at was not a hope but a plan. He had filed a challenge. He had gone to Cheyenne, sat in an office, signed a document, and set in motion a legal process designed to take her land. Not through violence, not through overt hostility, but through the slow bureaucratic machinery of territorial law. A machine that would grind forward through the winter, while she was trapped and isolated and unable to respond, and arrive at its conclusion in the spring with the impersonal efficiency of a foreclosure. He was not waiting for her to fail. He was ensuring it. Maren's body went very still. It was not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of recalibration, the momentary pause of a mind adjusting to a new variable in a complex equation. She had known Jedediah wanted her land. She had felt the intent behind his patient offers, the calculating patience in his voice. But she had not known he had acted on it, had not known he had converted his desire into a legal instrument aimed directly at the foundation of her existence. Her voice was quiet when she spoke a simple question directed not at Ada, but at the air between them. Who told you? Ada's mouth tightened, a barely perceptible contraction. A man in town who clerks at the office. He's a friend. He thought I should know, and I think you should know. Their eyes met. Ada was not asking Maren to thank her. She was not offering comfort or strategy or outrage. She was performing an act of witness, placing a piece of truth on the table, the way she had placed the jar of bear grease, and stepping back to let Maren do with it what she would. Maren nodded once. Ada turned and walked out into the November cold, her boots crunching on the frost, and the sound of her horse's hooves faded into the wind. And Maren was alone again with the wool and the wood, and the knowledge that the winter she was preparing for was no longer just a season. It was a siege, and the enemy was not only the cold. She did not change her plan. She did not ride to Cheyenne. She did not confront Jedediah. She did not waste a single hour of the dwindling daylight on anything other than the work. This was not resignation. It was strategy. The strategy of a woman who understood that the most powerful answer she could give to a man who believed she would die was to live. To be standing on her own land when the snow melted. To be alive and warm and in possession of her claim when the bureaucratic machinery arrived at her door, looking for a corpse or an empty house, and found instead a woman drinking coffee in a room that should not have been warm but was. She picked up the next clump of wool and drove it into the wall. 3 days later, she found the stakes. She had walked the eastern boundary of her claim, a habit she maintained weekly, checking the fence line and the survey markers that delineated the invisible border between her 160 acres and Jedediah's. The original markers were still in place, rough-cut stones set by the county surveyor 4 years ago. But beside one of them, driven into the frozen ground at a slight angle, was something new. A small wooden stake freshly cut with a strip of red cloth tied around its top. She knelt and examined it. The wood was still pale at the cut, unweathered. It had been placed recently within the last week. She understood what it meant. When a challenge was filed at the Territorial Land Office, a surveyor could be dispatched to verify the boundaries of the disputed claim. Jedediah had not placed these stakes himself. He had set the machinery in motion, and the machinery had sent a man with a hammer and a bag of stakes. And the man had come and gone while she was inside her house, packing wool into the walls, and neither of them had seen the other. And the stakes stood in the frozen ground like small red flags marking the advance of an army she could not see. She looked up and scanned the boundary line. There was another stake 40 yards to the north, and another beyond that, each one marking a line that did not correspond to the existing survey, but seemed to suggest a new one, a revised boundary that pushed several yards into her property, claiming the bend in the creek where the water ran deepest and the grass grew thickest. She did not pull the stakes. She stood and looked east toward the thin column of smoke rising from Jedediah Holt's chimney, and she felt the wind on her face counting down, always counting. And she understood that the ground beneath her feet was no longer just soil. It was contested territory, and the contest would be decided not by lawyers or land offices or the opinions of neighbors, but by the simplest and most brutal question the Wyoming winter could ask. "Will you still be here in the spring?" She turned back toward the soddy on the hill, the strange, compressed, wool-stinking, wood-filled burrow that the settlement had already written off as a monument to madness. She walked toward it with the steady, unhurried gait of a woman who was no longer building a house. She was building an argument, and the winter would be its only judge. The work entered a new phase in the second week of November. The walls were lined, the cavities packed, and the task that remained was the heaviest, stacking the interior firewood on the south and east walls to match the mass already built up on the north and west. The largest logs, the dense heartwood cuts of cottonwood that she had been saving for the base layers, were beyond what her body could manage alone. Each one weighed more than she did, and lifting them to waist height, positioning them with the precision the structure required, was not a matter of will. It was a matter of physics, and physics did not care how determined she was. She solved the problem the way her father would have solved it, by hiring hands. 2 young men had come through the valley the previous week, heading south from the Montana goldfields with empty pockets and the hollow, road-worn look of men who had found nothing but winter closing in behind them. They had stopped at the settlement looking for work, any work, and Maren had found them at the general store sitting on the porch with their hands in their pockets and their futures temporarily misplaced. She offered them 4 days of labor in exchange for salted elk, 20 pounds of flour, and a wool blanket each. They accepted without negotiation, which told her everything she needed to know about how desperate they were. Their names were Calvin and Roy brothers from Missouri, and they had the lean, uncomplaining strength of men who had spent their youth on farms and their recent years learning that the West was not the golden story they had been told. They did not ask Maren why she wanted the logs stacked inside her house. They did not offer opinions or exchange glances of concern. They simply worked lifting and positioning the heavy cuts according to her precise instructions, fitting them together like the courses of a wall, while she directed the placement from inside the shrinking room, orchestrating the construction of something they could not see the purpose of and did not care to question. Paid labor has a beautiful indifference to motive. Calvin. The older one did pause, once holding a thick round of cottonwood against his chest, sweat freezing in his eyebrows. He looked at the wall of wood rising around him, and then at Maren, and a half-smile crossed his weathered face, the smile of a man who has decided that the world is strange, and the best response is quiet amusement. His voice carried no judgment, just genuine curiosity filtered through exhaustion. "Ma'am, you building a fort or a fireplace?" Maren allowed herself the smallest flicker of acknowledgement. "Both," she answered, and that was the end of the conversation. They finished the heavy work in 4 days. The base layers of all four walls were now solid. The densest wood at the bottom, lighter cuts above the whole structure, rising about a foot thick around the perimeter of the room. After the brothers left, heading south with their flour and blankets and a story they would probably tell in saloons for years, Maren continued alone, adding the upper courses with smaller, lighter logs she could manage by herself. The room contracted to its final dimensions, roughly 10 by 14 feet of usable space, compressed but livable, the bed and table and stove arranged in a tight constellation at the center. The walls of wood surrounded her on all sides, their pale, split faces catching the lamplight. Their collective mass an invisible presence. She could feel, even when she was not looking at them, a density, a gravitational weight, as if the room had developed its own quiet center of gravity. It was during this phase alone, again fitting the smaller logs into place on the east wall, that the memory of Vermont found her. Not the memory she had already visited the single evening of Ewan's lesson about wool and trapped air. A different one, older and more complete, rising. Unbidden the way memories do when the body is engaged in repetitive labor and the mind slips its leash. The sheep barn. Their second winter in Vermont before they came west, when Ewan was still working for old Harlan Yates on the big farm outside of Middlebury. January, a night so cold the nails in the barn door had frost halos around their heads, and the air outside was a thing with teeth. Ewan had taken her hand and led her from the farmhouse to the barn, not speaking, just walking. His breath a white ribbon unspooling behind him. He had pulled open the heavy door, and the heat had hit her like a wall, a dense, humid warmth that had no right to exist in a structure, with gaps between its boards and no stove of any kind. 200 sheep packed shoulder to shoulder in the straw, their collective body heat filling the enclosed space with a warmth that was almost tropical. The snow on the underside of the roof was melting, dripping in slow, irregular rhythms onto the backs of the animals below, who did not seem to notice or care. The air smelled of wool and dung, and the particular sweetness of animal warmth, and it was so profoundly comfortable after the killing cold outside that Maren had felt her eyes sting with involuntary tears, the body's confused response to sudden relief. Ewan had stood beside her in the doorway, his face lit by the single lantern hanging from a beam, and his expression had been one of quiet satisfaction. A teacher who has arranged the lesson and is now watching the student arrive at the conclusion on her own. He did not say thermal mass. He did not use any word that would have appeared in an engineering manual. His hand swept across the packed bodies, each one a small furnace wrapped in insulating wool, and his voice carried the rhythm of something rehearsed, many times passed down and worn smooth like a river stone. Every one of these animals is a warm rock that breathes, 200 warm rocks in a closed room, and the room takes care of itself. She had understood standing there in the sheep-scented heat that the principle was not about fire. It was about accumulation, about mass, about the capacity of dense material to absorb heat, slowly store it, and release it gradually, turning a brief input of energy into a sustained output of warmth. The sheep were not heating the barn the way a stove heats a room with a concentrated blast of energy from a single source. They were heating it the way the sun heats the earth diffusely collectively, each small body contributing its portion to a reservoir of warmth that the barn's walls such as they were held in place. It was the same principle she was now applying to her soddy, substituting wood for sheep, a stove for animal metabolism, and packed wool for the closed walls of a barn. The second memory followed the first, as memories often do when the door is opened. The bread oven. Harlan Yates's wife, a hard, knuckle-scarred woman named Edna, whose family had farmed the same valley since before the Revolution, baked bread in a stone oven built into the back wall of the farmhouse kitchen. She would build a fire inside the oven in the morning, let it burn for 2 hours, then rake out the coals and slide the loaves in to bake on the residual heat of the stones. The oven had no fire in it when the bread was baking. The stones did the work, radiating back the heat they had absorbed, cooking the bread slowly and evenly for hours after the flames were gone. Maren had watched this process dozens of times without thinking about it. Ewan had watched it once and seen the entire architecture of an idea. He had placed his palm flat against the oven stones that evening, 6 hours after the fire had been raked out. The stones were still warm, a deep, steady warmth that seemed to pulse faintly under his hand. He had turned to Maren with the expression she knew well, the look of a man who had just found a piece of a puzzle he had been assembling in his mind for years, and his words had the weight of something arrived at rather than invented. Stone does not make fire. Stone remembers fire. Then, because he was always honest about the limits of his own analogies, he had added the qualification that mattered, the one that separated his thinking from the wishful delusion of a dreamer. Wood does not remember as well as stone. It never will, but enough wood in a small enough room remembers long enough to keep a person alive. She had asked him why nobody built that way. His eyes had narrowed with something that was not quite amusement and not quite frustration. The particular expression of a man who has spent his life watching people solve problems badly because they have never questioned their first assumption. Because everyone believes the answer to cold is a bigger fire. No one thinks to keep what they already have. Seeing the result is not the same as understanding the principle, Maren. The memory released her. She was back in the soddy, a half-fitted log in her hands, the November wind audible through the packed walls as a low, distant murmur rather than the shrieking invasion it would have been a month ago. She positioned the log, pushed it into place, and reached for the next. The principle was sound. Ewan had been clear about the limitation wood was inferior to stone as a thermal reservoir. But she was not trying to build a stone oven. She was trying to survive a single winter. And enough wood in a small enough room would remember the heat long enough to make the difference between a livable temperature and a killing one. The margin was narrow, but narrow margins were all she had ever worked with. The afternoon Prudence Holt came to visit Maren was on her knees in the cramped center of the room, packing a final seam of wool into a gap where two planks met imperfectly behind the east wall's woodpile. The smell of lanolin was at its most concentrated near the floor, where the heat from the stove pushed the heavy, oily vapors downward, and the room had the dense, enclosed atmosphere of a place that had been sealed against the world so thoroughly that the world had begun to seem theoretical. Prudence did not knock either. She appeared in the doorway the way weather appears without invitation, filling the frame with her particular brand of sharp-boned, sharp-tongued curiosity. She had come to see for herself. The gossip she had been circulating for weeks was satisfying, but it lacked the authority of first-hand observation, and Prudence Holt was a woman who believed in the authority of her own eyes above all other sources. She stepped inside and stopped. Her nose wrinkled first. Then her eyes adjusted to the dimness and traveled slowly around the room, taking in the towering wood walls, the compressed living space, the visible tufts of greasy wool protruding from the gaps in the planking, the narrow corridor between bed and stove and table that was all that remained of what had once been a proper room. Her expression underwent a rapid evolution from curiosity to disbelief, to something that settled finally into the comfortable certainty of confirmed suspicion. Her voice was high and clear in the enclosed space, a sound designed to carry Lord in heaven, Maren, you're building your own coffin. The words landed with surgical precision, not because they were clever, although Prudence certainly thought they were, but because they found the one fracture in Maren's composure that she had not known existed. The room was narrow. The walls were close. The woods surrounded her on all sides, floor to ceiling, and in the dim lamplight, with the heavy air pressing down and the smell of wool and lanolin sealing out the world, the resemblance was undeniable. A wooden box, lined, enclosed, built to contain a body. Maren did not show the impact. Her face remained the same weathered mask she had been wearing all autumn, the expression of a woman who had decided what she was going to do and was simply doing it. Her voice was level when she answered, quiet enough that Prudence had to lean forward to hear it, which was the point. I am building the opposite, Mrs. Holt. Prudence absorbed this with the polite blankness of a woman who has already reached her conclusion and is merely waiting for the other party to stop talking. She gave the room one more sweep, with her eyes gathering details for the next round of storytelling, then turned and walked out, her boots sharp on the frozen ground, her back straight, with the righteous posture of someone who has done a kindness by bearing witness to a tragedy. Maren listened to the hoofbeats recede. Then she sat down on the edge of her cot, which was now wedged so tightly between the wood walls that she could extend both arms and touch split logs on either side, and she allowed the word to find its target. Coffin. She turned it over in her mind, examining it the way she would examine a suspect joint in a piece of ironwork, looking for the flaw. The room was not a coffin. A coffin was a container for the dead. This room was a container for heat, for trapped air, for the accumulated knowledge of a man who had understood the physical world with a depth that his neighbors could not fathom. It was the opposite of a coffin. It was a vessel for survival. But the doubt, once admitted, was difficult to contain. She lay on the cot that night and stared at the ceiling, which was close enough to touch, and felt the wood pressing in from all sides. And for the first time since she had begun the work, she asked herself the question she had been refusing to ask. What if she was wrong? What if Ewan's principles, sound in theory, failed in practice at the scale she was attempting? What if the wood did not hold enough heat? What if the wool rotted? What if she had built not a fortress but a trap, sealed herself into an elaborate tomb of her own design, and the winter found its way in anyway, as it always did, as it always would? Because the cold was patient and relentless and did not care about principles of faith or the memory of dead shepherds. She lay in the dark and fought the doubt the way she would fight a fever with the only medicine she had, which was reason. The math was sound. Ewan's observations were confirmed by her own experience. The sheep barn in Vermont had worked. The bread oven had worked. Dense mass absorbs heat and releases it slowly. Trapped air insulates. Lanolin repels water. These were not theories. They were facts demonstrated by the physical world in 1,000 observable ways, and her house was nothing more than an arrangement of those facts into a structure designed to exploit them. The doubt was not evidence, it was fear, and fear was not a reliable guide. She slept eventually, and in the morning she got up and continued working. The letter was Ada Dunmore's idea, and Ada executed it with the same economy of effort she applied to everything. She rode to the settlement's small post office, a shelf in the back of the general store, and mailed a single page to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. The letter stated in plain language that Ada Dunmore, resident of the valley for 19 years, personally attested that Maren Calloway was in continuous residence on her homestead. Claim was actively engaged in improvement of the property and had not at any time abandoned or neglected the land. She signed her name, noted the date, and paid the postage, and the letter went into the mail sack and began its slow journey east to the capital. A single sheet of paper, carrying the weight of one woman's quiet conviction that another woman deserved to keep what was hers. When Maren learned of it, she had not asked Ada to do it. She had not asked anyone for anything. Ada mentioned it in passing, as if it were a small domestic chore, something between mending a fence and feeding the chickens. Maren searched for the right response and found only the obvious question, why? Ada's answer came without hesitation. A sentence that had clearly been composed long before it was spoken, carried inside and waiting for the moment it was needed. Because I know what it is to have something taken that you built with your own hands. Garrett lost his trapline to a man who filed a claim on land Garrett had worked for 15 years. He never got it back. He never got over it either. She did not elaborate. The parallel was clear enough, and Ada was not a woman who explained her parallels. She had acted because action was what she understood, because words without action were just wind, and she had lived in Wyoming long enough to know what wind was worth. Maren rode to the Holt place the following day. She did not plan what she would say. Planning implied uncertainty, and she was not uncertain. She was clear in a way that felt almost dangerous. The clarity of a person who has passed through doubt and come out the other side with something harder and more durable in its place. The ride took 20 minutes across open ground. The wind at her back, the sun low and white in a sky that was beginning to lose its autumn color and take on the flat, milky quality of approaching winter. She saw the Holt cabin from a quarter-mile away, smoke rising from the chimney in a straight vertical column. The yard tidy, the woodpile massive and properly stacked against the leeward wall, everything in its correct and expected place. She dismounted at the fence and waited. She did not call out or approach the door. She stood beside her horse in the cold and waited. And after a few minutes the door opened, and Jedediah came out, his coat half-buttoned. His face registering surprise and then a rapid, controlled shift to neutrality. He walked to the fence. They stood on opposite sides of it, 3 feet of split rail between them, the wind pulling at their clothes. Her voice carried no anger because anger was not what she felt. And she had learned long ago that the most effective weapon in any confrontation was the truth delivered without ornament. You filed a challenge on my land at the office in Cheyenne. It was not a question. Jedediah's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath the weathered skin. He did not deny it. He had lived too long and respected plain dealing too much to deny a fact stated plainly. Instead, he did what men of his type always do when confronted with an action they believe to be justified. He explained it. Maren, I'll say it straight. I don't believe you'll survive the winter. That's not cruelty. That's 20 years of watching this valley take people who were stronger and better supplied than you are right now. His voice was steady, the voice of a man delivering a verdict he considered merciful. When you are gone, that land sits empty. The creek goes to waste. The grass grows wild. I've got cattle that need water and pasture. I'm not stealing anything. I'm preparing for what's coming. From inside the cabin, Prudence's voice cut through the cold air. Sharp as a hatchet, aimed with the precision of a woman who had been listening from behind the door. He's trying to save you, Maren. Sell the land. Go back east. Live. Maren looked at Jedediah. She looked at the cabin behind him, warm and solid and built by a man who had never questioned the way things were done because the way things were done had always worked well enough for him. She looked at the smoke rising from his chimney fed by the big roaring fire he believed was the only answer to the cold. The fire that consumed wood at a rate that would exhaust even his enormous stockpile before March. She saw a man imprisoned by his own certainty, and she understood that he was not evil. He was limited. He could not imagine a world in which he survived, and so he had arranged reality to accommodate his failure of imagination. Her response was not dramatic. It was not a speech or a threat or a plea. It was a statement of fact delivered with the same even tone she used to describe the properties of lanolin or the behavior of trapped air. A tone that left no room for argument because it was not arguing. It was declaring, "Spring will come, Mr. Holt, and I will be standing on my land when it does." She mounted her horse and rode west back toward the hill, where her soddy crouched against the slope like something bracing for impact. She did not look back. Looking back was a luxury she could not afford, and Maren Calloway had made a practice of refusing luxuries since the day she buried her husband in August dirt and began the long solitary process of converting his knowledge into her survival. The sky changed on the 26th of November. She woke before dawn and knew it immediately, the way an animal knows a shift in atmospheric pressure, the way a sailor reads the sea. The blue was gone. In its place was a flat, featureless gray, the color of cataracts of old pewter, of a sky that had stopped being a sky and become a ceiling. And beneath that ceiling, the wind had stopped. The silence was the most frightening thing she had experienced since Ewan's death. The wind had been a constant for months, a presence so persistent that she had stopped hearing it the way she had stopped hearing her own heartbeat. Its absence was louder than its presence had ever been, a vacuum that pressed against the eardrums and made the world feel swollen and wrong. The cottonwoods along the creek, which had been in perpetual agitation for weeks, stood perfectly still, their bare branches suspended in the thick air like the fingers of upraised hands. No birds, no movement. The valley held its breath with the terrible concentrated patience of something gathering its strength. She knew the sign. Ewan had taught her to read it one evening on the farm in Vermont, when the same gray ceiling had descended, and the same unnatural stillness had settled over the Green Mountains. And he had stood on the porch and looked at the sky with an expression she had never seen before. Something between respect and fear. The expression of a man who understood that what was coming was bigger than anything he could control. He had spoken quietly, almost to himself. When the wind stops and the sky goes blind, you do not prepare. You are either already ready or you are already dead. Maren was ready. She had been ready for weeks, and the final preparations took less than an hour. She checked the door seal, pressing additional scraps of wool into the gap between the frame and the heavy timber. She filled her water barrels from the creek, making 3 trips with the yoke across her shoulders, the water sloshing cold against her legs. She brought in the last of the salted meat and flour from the root cellar, stacking it in the narrow space between the stove and the bed. She fed the horse a double ration of hay and secured the lean-to's canvas windbreak. And then, on her final inspection of the roof, running her hands along the interior surface of the sod ceiling, where it met the top of the wall, she found it. A crack, small no wider than her little finger, running diagonally across the northeast corner, where the sod had dried and contracted during the autumn, pulling away from the timber beam it was supposed to seal against. She pressed her thumb into it and felt the faintest whisper of cold air, an almost imperceptible draft, the kind that would mean nothing in ordinary weather and could mean everything in a blizzard. The wind, that relentless searcher, would find this crack, the way water finds a crack in a dam. It would push through, widen it, and establish a channel for heat to escape, undermining the entire system she had spent 2 months building. She packed it immediately, forcing a wad of wool mixed with Ada's bear grease into the gap, pressing hard with her thumb until the draft stopped. The repair felt solid. The grease would seal the wool against moisture, and the wool would fill the space. But she could not test it, could not know for certain that it would hold against the sustained battering pressure of a full blizzard, and the uncertainty lodged in her chest like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore. The first flakes began to fall in the early afternoon, drifting down through the dead air with the slow, aimless quality of ash from a distant fire. They were not storm flakes. They were prologue flakes, the sky's way of clearing its throat before the speech. Within an hour, they had thickened into a steady curtain of white that erased the horizon line and turned the middle distance into a featureless void. By dusk, the curtain had become a wall, and the wall was moving no longer. Falling vertically but driving horizontally as the wind returned, not as the keen-edged blade of autumn, but as something deeper, something with weight and mass and intent. A guttural roar that struck the north face of the soddy like the open palm of an enormous hand. Maren closed the door. She lowered the heavy bar into its brackets. She lit the lamp and placed it on the table, and its small flame guttered once in a draft that came from nowhere. She could identify and then steadied, burning upright in the still air of the sealed room. She stood in the center of her creation, surrounded on all sides by the wood and wool and packed earth that stood between her and the howling dark. And she felt the house absorb the first blow of the storm, the way a fighter absorbs a punch, leaning into it, taking it on the heavy northern wall where the thickest wood and the densest packing bore the brunt. The sound was different from any storm she had endured in this house before. In previous winters, the wind had been a high-pitched antagonist, finding every crack and crevice, shrieking through gaps, rattling the door, making the lamp flame dance and the temperature plunge. Now it was muffled, distant, translated by the layers of wood and wool and trapped air, into a deep vibrating hum she felt through the floor, rather than heard through the walls. It was the sound of her system working. The sound of physics doing what physics does when the conditions are arranged correctly, and she listened to it the way a mother listens to a newborn's breathing, with fierce, terrified attention, searching for any irregularity that might signal failure. She built a small fire in the stove. Not the inferno her neighbors would be feeding at this moment, cramming logs into fire boxes and damping down drafts and burning through their stockpiles at a rate that would leave them scrambling before February. Hers was a modest fire, calculated, a few pieces of well-chosen wood, arranged to burn slowly and steadily, a maintenance fire whose purpose was not to blast the room with heat, but to feed it gently and continuously into the thermal mass of the surrounding walls. The stove would warm the air would warm the wood would hold the warmth and release it back slowly over hours long after the fire had burned down to embers. She was not fighting the storm. She was not competing with it. She was simply existing inside it, separated from its fury by a barrier of applied intelligence, and the only question that remained was whether the barrier would hold. She sat at her table and poured a cup of chicory coffee from the pot on the stove. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup and listened. Past the muffled roar of the wind, past the gentle ticking of the stovepipe as it expanded in the heat, down to the subtlest sound in the room, the barely perceptible creak of wood absorbing warmth, the sound of dense fibers expanding by fractions of a millimeter as heat energy migrated from their surfaces into their cores. It was the sound of her principle at work, and it was in that moment the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Outside, the blizzard settled into stay. The first night passed in a kind of suspended animation. The world reduced to the dimensions of the lamplit corridor and the deep percussive thrumming of the wind against the north wall. Maren did not sleep. She sat at the table with her hands around the cooling cup of chicory and listened with every nerve in her body, passing the storm the way a telegraph operator passes code, searching for the signal within the noise. The signal she was listening for was silence, the absence of the draft, the confirmation that her walls were holding. And they were. The air inside the room remained still, undisturbed, carrying only the faint warmth radiating from the stove and the wood surrounding it. The temperature was cool but not hostile. A livable neutral that required a shawl, but not the heavy buffalo coat she had needed in previous winters. She monitored her own body the way she monitored the room, cataloging sensation with clinical detachment fingers, flexible toes, warm in wool socks. Breathing easy, no visible condensation on exhale. The system was functioning. By dawn, which arrived not as light, but as a barely perceptible shift in the quality of darkness visible through the snow-crusted window, the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers. She did not rush to feed it. This was the test within the test, the moment when the thermal mass either proved its worth or revealed itself as wishful thinking. She sat still and waited, tracking the temperature of the room with her skin, and felt the wood doing its work. The heat she had fed into it over the past hours was migrating back out slowly, steadily, a gentle exhalation of stored energy that kept the air in the room from plunging toward the killing cold that was pressing against the walls from every direction. The stove was nearly dead. The room was still livable. The wood remembered. She allowed herself a measured handful of fuel. 3 small pieces of pine, just enough to bring the embers back to a working flame and begin the cycle again. Feed the air. Let the air feed the wood. Let the wood hold what the air could not. The cycle was self-reinforcing, each repetition building. On the last, the thermal mass accumulating heat the way a savings account accumulates interest, growing fractionally with each small, consistent deposit. It was not dramatic. It was not a roaring blaze that pushed back the darkness with brute force. It was something quieter and more powerful a system in equilibrium with its environment borrowing from the storm, only the stillness it needed to function. The second day turned on a single drop of water. She saw it in the late morning, a bead of moisture forming at the junction of the sod ceiling, and the northeast timber beam precisely at the location of the crack she had packed the previous day. The bead swelled, hung and fell, striking the top of the east wall's firewood with an audible tap. Then another, and another, a slow metronomic drip that was as quiet as a heartbeat and as alarming as a gunshot. She was on her feet, immediately dragging the table across the compressed floor to the corner, climbing onto it with the economized movements of a body that had no energy to waste on grace. The crack had not failed entirely. The wool and grease she had packed into it was still in place, still blocking the direct passage of air. But the sustained assault of the wind had driven moisture into the sod surrounding the repair, and the sod, saturated and freezing, was contracting, pulling away from the packed material and opening a hairline fissure alongside it. The draft was not coming through the original crack. It was coming through a new one parallel to the first, a secondary failure that she had not anticipated and could not have prevented. She felt it on her upraised hand, a thread of cold air so thin it was almost imaginary, but real enough to make the lamp flame lean perceptibly toward the south wall. In the sealed environment she had created, even this minuscule breach was significant. It was a pinhole in a balloon, a hairline fracture in a dam. Left unchecked, it would widen as the sod continued to contract, and the convective loop it established, cold air entering high warm air, escaping through any corresponding gap below, would slowly, methodically drain the heat from the room, the way a slow leak drains a barrel. Her hands were already working before the analysis was complete. She scooped a fistful of raw wool from the small reserve she had kept aside, mixed it with a heavy daub of bear grease, kneading the two together, until the mixture was a dense, pliable putty that smelled of sheep and rendered fat. She pressed it into the new fissure, working it in with her thumb, forcing it deep into the contracting sod, then layering more over the top, building up a thick pad of greased wool that covered both the original repair and the secondary crack. The wind pushed back. She could feel it testing the seal, probing for weakness, a blind and mindless force operating on the simple principle that pressure differentials must equalize. She held her thumb against the pad and pressed harder, denying the equalization, refusing the physics of the breach with the physics of the repair. And after a long minute, during which the outcome balanced on the edge of a knife, the draft stopped. The lamp flame straightened. The air stilled. She climbed down from the table on legs that were shaking, not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash that follows a moment of genuine crisis. She sat on the edge of the cot and looked at her hands. The right one smeared with grease and wool fibers, the knuckles raw and split from weeks of labor, the fingernails cracked and black with grime. These were not the hands of a theorist. They were the hands of a practitioner. A woman who understood that knowledge without action was an empty vessel, that the most elegant principle in the world was worthless if you could not climb onto a table in the middle of a blizzard and press it into a crack with your bare thumb. She flexed her fingers, feeling the sting of the split skin, and understood something that Ewan, for all his brilliance, had never had the chance to learn. He had given her the architecture, but architecture was not survival. Architecture was a drawing on paper, a theory in the mind, a set of principles waiting to be tested. Survival was the moment when the theory failed, in some small unexpected way, and you fixed it with your hands and your nerve, and whatever materials were within reach. And you kept fixing it because the storm did not care about your theory. It only cared about the crack. The third day was the longest. The blizzard had settled into a sustained fury that seemed less like weather than like geology, a permanent rearrangement of the atmosphere that would never end. The window was completely opaque now, buried under a thickness of compacted snow that turned it into a dim bluish rectangle of filtered light, a porthole looking out onto nothing. The world beyond the walls had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. There was only the room, the stove, the wood, the wool, the air, and the wind, which had become so constant and so deep that it no longer registered as sound, but as vibration, a frequency felt in the bones and the teeth and the soles of the feet, the background hum of a planet trying to shake itself apart. Maren fell into the rhythm of pure subsistence. She slept in short intervals, ate sparingly from her stores of salted meat and hard biscuit, tended the small fire with the attentiveness of a nurse tending a critical patient. She did not think about Jedediah or the land challenge or the community's judgment. She did not think about the future. She existed in an absolute present tense. Her consciousness contracted to the dimensions of the room and the simple repeating imperatives of warmth and breath and fuel. It was, she realized, a kind of freedom. The storm had stripped away every concern that was not essential, every anxiety that was not immediate, and left her with nothing but the bedrock question of continued existence. And in answering that question moment by moment, she found a calm so profound it bordered on joy. She slept on the third night with her hand resting on the wood wall beside her cot, feeling the faint warmth pulse against her palm, a rhythm so slow and steady it might have been the heartbeat of the house itself. She woke to silence, not the ordinary silence of a quiet morning, which is composed of 100 small sounds that the ear has learned to ignore: the creak of wood, the settling of snow, the distant cry of a bird. This was a total silence, an absolute and annihilating absence of sound that pressed against the eardrums with physical weight. The vibration that had been her companion for 72 hours was gone, cut off so abruptly that its absence felt like a detonation, the sudden removal of a force that the body had been unconsciously bracing against, leaving her weightless and disoriented in the dark. She lay still for a long moment, recalibrating. Then she rose and went to the window. Black. Not the black of night, but the black of solid matter, pressed against the glass. She moved to the door, lifted the bar and pulled. It swung inward 6 inches and stopped with a soft, dense thud against a wall of compacted snow. She was entombed. The panic arrived on schedule. An ancient mammalian response to enclosure, a surge of adrenaline and cortisol that accelerated her heart rate and shortened her breathing, and whispered with the quiet insistence of evolutionary imperative that she was trapped in a box underground and would die here in the dark. She allowed the panic exactly 3 breaths. She gave it that much space to exist, to make its case. And then she dismissed it, not by suppressing it, but by answering it with evidence. The air was breathable. The temperature was stable. She had food and water. The sod walls and roof, buried under tons of snow, were structurally sound, the weight distributed evenly across the timber beams Ewan had set with characteristic over-engineering. She was not trapped. She was insulated, wrapped in an additional layer of nature's own version of her system, a blanket of snow whose trapped air pockets provided exactly the same kind of thermal barrier she had built into her walls. The blizzard, having tried to kill her, had inadvertently given her another coat. She stood in the center of the dark room and took inventory, not of her supplies, which she knew were adequate, but of herself, her physical state. She performed the assessment with the same clinical detachment she had applied on the first night. But now the data points had a different significance, because now the storm was over, and the data was not preliminary. It was a verdict. She was not cold. Her extremities were functional, her core temperature stable. She was wearing a wool dress and a shawl, clothing that would have been suicidal in any previous winter, without the buffalo coat, the heavy blankets, the desperate proximity to a raging fire. The air around her was cool, perhaps 50 degrees, perhaps a little less, but it lacked the penetrating, bone-deep chill that had characterized every winter she had spent in this house before the modification. It was the difference between standing in a root cellar and standing on an open plain. One was uncomfortable, the other was lethal. She was in the root cellar. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the stacked firewood of the interior wall. The contact sent a small shock through her nervous system, not of cold, but of its opposite. The wood was not warm. It was not radiating heat the way the stove radiated heat with aggressive directional energy. It was doing something subtler and more profound. It was holding an absence of cold, a residual thermal presence that felt exactly like what Ewan had described. Exactly like the bread oven stones 6 hours after the fire was raked out. A deep, patient warmth stored in the dense fibers of the wood and released so gradually that it was almost imperceptible except by contrast with the frozen world it was holding at bay. She pulled her hand away and pressed it to her own cheek. The cheek was warm, the hand was warm. The tears that came were warm too, sliding down her face and dropping onto the front of her wool dress. And she did not wipe them away because they were not tears of grief or relief or triumph. They were tears of connection, the physical expression of a bond that death had severed, but knowledge had preserved. Ewan was in these walls, not his ghost, not his spirit, not any mystical residue of his personality. His intelligence, his observation, his patient and glamorous, bone-deep understanding of the way the physical world behaved. It was here in the trapped air and the greased wool and the thermal mass of 1,000 pounds of cottonwood working exactly as he had predicted it would, keeping her alive with the quiet fidelity of a promise kept from the far side of the grave. She did not say his name. She did not need to. He was not in the sound. He was in the warmth. The digging took most of the day. She worked with the small cold shovel, the only tool that fit in the narrow space between the door and the snow wall, carving a tunnel upward and outward through the packed mass, scooping the excavated snow back into the room and packing it into the empty space beneath the cot. The work was exhausting, made more difficult by the confined space and the need to dig at an upward angle to account for the depth of snow that had accumulated above the door's ground level. Her arms burned, her back seized. She stopped twice to eat and drink and let her heart rate settle, and then she continued, because the only alternative was to not continue, and that was not something she was capable of considering. When the shovel broke through the surface, the light hit her like a physical blow. She had been in dimness for 3.5 days. Her eyes adjusted to the amber glow of the lamp and the pale blue ghost light that filtered through the snow-covered window, and the sudden, unmediated brilliance of sunlight on fresh snow overwhelmed her optic nerves and turned the world into a blazing white void. She closed her eyes, opened them slowly, and the landscape assembled itself in stages. White. Endless, sculptural, impossible white shaped by the wind into dunes and ridges and sweeping curves that bore no relationship to the terrain she knew. The sky above was a blue so deep and so pure, it looked artificial, the oversaturated blue of a painted ceiling. And the sun sat in it like a cold white eye, brilliant but heatless, pouring light onto a world it could illuminate but not warm. The snow reached the eaves of the soddy. In the drifts against the north wall, it rose above the roofline, a solid white ramp that blended the house seamlessly into the hillside behind it. The cottonwoods along Dryer Creek were buried to their lower branches, their dark trunks rising from the white surface like the masts of ships sunk in a frozen sea. The lean-to where she kept the horse was half collapsed under the weight of snow, its canvas windbreak torn loose on one side. But the structure had held enough to create a pocket of shelter against the hillside. She found the mare standing in this pocket, shaggy and gaunt and crusted with ice but alive, her breath steaming in the cold air, her dark eyes blinking against the sudden light. Maren cleared the snow from around her, broke the ice on the water bucket, and fed her the last of the hay. The animal pressed its muzzle against her shoulder and stood there breathing, and Maren allowed herself the brief luxury of leaning into the warmth of another living body before turning back to the work of digging out. Nothing else moved. No wind, no animal, no human figure breaking the perfect, terrible geometry of the snowfield. The valley was a held breath, a stopped clock, a world paused between one heartbeat and the next. Half a mile to the east, a thin line of smoke rose from Jedediah Holt's chimney, perfectly vertical in the still air. 2 days later, the figure appeared, a dark, laboring shape moving across the snowfield from the east, progressing with the slow, determined rhythm of heavy snowshoes, stopping every 50 yards to lean on the shovel it carried and catch its breath. It took the figure nearly an hour to cover the distance, and Maren watched it from her clear doorway without moving to meet it. Not out of hostility, but because she understood with the instinct of a person who has spent a long time thinking about the relationship between evidence and belief, that this moment needed to arrive at her door on its own terms. Jedediah Holt stopped 20 feet from the entrance. He was breathing hard, his face flushed and raw above the scarf wrapped around his neck, his eyebrows frosted white. He carried the shovel across his shoulders like a yoke, and his posture was that of a man braced for something terrible, a man who has come to perform the grim duty of digging a body out of a collapsed house and has prepared himself as much as a person can for what he will find. What he found was Maren Calloway standing upright in the cleared doorway of her soddy, wearing a wool dress and a shawl and no coat, calmly scraping the last of the packed snow from her threshold with a flat piece of iron. His mouth opened. No sound came out. He stood in the snowfield, the shovel balanced on his shoulders, and stared at her with an expression that underwent a visible transformation. A tectonic shift from dread to disbelief, to something he did not have a name for. Something that existed in the gap between what he had known to be true and what was standing in front of him, refusing to be dead. Maren finished clearing the threshold, set the iron piece against the wall, and straightened. She looked at him the way she had looked at him across the fence on the day she confronted him about the land filing directly and without theater. It was a bad one. His voice when he found it came out rough and half-strangled, the voice of a man whose certainties were crumbling faster than he could shore them up. We thought. The storm. We thought. Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Holt? It is still warm. She stepped aside and gestured toward the open door, and the gesture was not an invitation. It was an exhibit. She was not asking him in for hospitality. She was asking him in for evidence. He followed her inside, ducking through the doorway with the stiff, cautious movements of a man entering unfamiliar territory. The air hit him first. He had just crossed a half-mile of frozen landscape in temperatures that turned his breath to ice crystals before it left his mouth, and his lungs were raw and aching from the effort. The air inside Maren's house was not warm in the way he understood warmth, not the aggressive face-slapping heat of a room with a big fire roaring. It was something he had never experienced, a still neutral, inhabitable atmosphere that did not attack and did not welcome, that simply existed at a temperature the human body could sustain without distress. He breathed it in and felt his chest unlock, his shoulders drop. His whole body release a tension he had not known he was carrying. The air was not fighting anything. It was just air held in place, doing its quiet, invisible work. His eyes adjusted. He saw the small fire in the stove, barely more than embers consuming fuel, at a rate that would have been laughable in his own cabin. He saw the walls of stacked wood, their pale faces glowing faintly in the lamplight surrounding the room, like the walls of a cathedral built by a carpenter instead of a mason. He walked to the north wall, the one that had taken the full force of the blizzard for 3 days, and he placed his bare hand against it. He held it there for a long time. The wood was not hot. It was not even clearly warm in any way he could have articulated. But it was profoundly, unmistakably not cold. It held a residual presence, a stored energy, a faint thermal signature that pulsed against his palm like the memory of a fire that had burned there once and left its imprint in the grain. He moved his hand to a different spot, the same, and another, the same. The entire wall from floor to ceiling was saturated with a gentle, diffused warmth that it was releasing back into the room at a rate so slow it was almost subliminal. A warmth that had no visible source, because its source was everywhere distributed through every log and every fiber of the massive structure that surrounded him. His eyes moved to the corner where the planking met the ceiling, and he saw it, a tuft of greasy, discolored wool protruding from the gap between two boards, the visible edge of the insulation layer that Maren had packed into every cavity in the house. He reached out and touched it. His fingertips came away slick with lanolin. Jedediah Holt was not a man given to grand pronouncements or emotional displays. He had built his life on the solid ground of observable fact, and the observable facts of this room were dismantling everything he believed about winter and survival, and the capacities of the woman standing behind him. He turned from the wall and looked at Maren, who was pouring coffee from a battered tin pot into 2 cups. Her movements unhurried, her face composed, betraying nothing of what this moment must mean to her. His voice came out low and stripped of everything except the bare truth. I was wrong. Maren set the cup in front of him. The coffee steamed faintly in the still air. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She looked at him with the level, unblinking gaze of a woman who had spent an autumn building an argument out of wood and wool and physical law, and who had just watched the argument win its case. Her response was quiet, and it carried a weight that extended far beyond the walls of the room, far beyond the question of insulation or thermal mass, all the way to the fence line, where he had told her she could not carry the weight of her own land. You were not only wrong about the house, Mr. Holt. The silence that followed was the most articulate silence Maren had ever heard. It said everything that Jedediah could not acknowledge, every assumption, every calculation, every quiet act of aggression disguised as concern. He was not a man who apologized. The architecture of his pride did not include that room. But he was a man who recognized reality when it placed its hand on his chest and pushed. And the reality of this room was pushing hard. He nodded, slow, once. Then he picked up the cup and drank, and the coffee was warm, and the air was warm, and the wood at his back pulsed with its faint stored heat. And the woman who should have been dead was standing in front of him, alive and composed, and utterly immovably present on her own land. He set the cup down and stood. At the door he stopped without turning, his profile dark against the blinding white of the snowfield beyond. His jaw worked once, the muscles tightening and releasing, and the words that came out were not an apology, but something rarer and more costly, a concession, extracted not by argument, but by evidence. I'll withdraw the filing. 3 words. No explanation, no justification, no request for understanding. He stepped through the door and walked back across the snow toward his own chimney, and Maren watched him go, and the watching was enough. The legal machinery ground to its conclusion in March, with the quiet anticlimax that bureaucracy prefers. Ada's letter had arrived in Cheyenne before the blizzard, and Jedediah's withdrawal arrived after it. And the clerk at the Territorial Land Office, a man who processed dozens of such filings each season and cared about none of them, stamped the withdrawal, closed the file, and moved on to the next piece of paper on his desk. Maren's claim was confirmed without ceremony, without a hearing, without anyone in Cheyenne knowing or caring that the piece of ground described in the filing had been the site of a battle fought not with lawyers, but with wool and wood and the precise application of physical law. She received the confirmation letter in April, read it once, folded it, and placed it in the tin box where she kept Ewan's pocket watch and the deed to the land. Then she went outside and fed the horse. The news of her survival propagated through the valley with the slow, inevitable momentum of snowmelt. By the time the paths were passable, every household within 10 miles had heard some version of the story, and the versions for once converged on the truth rather than diverging from it. The widow Calloway had survived the worst blizzard in a decade alone in a house that should have been a death trap, and not only survived but been comfortable warm enough to offer coffee to a man who had come to dig out her corpse. The wool in the walls, the wood stacked inside, the small fire that did the work of a bonfire. The details that had been evidence of madness 2 weeks ago were now evidence of genius, or at the very least of a knowledge so far in advance of the community's understanding that it had been indistinguishable from insanity. Ada Dunmore came first, as Maren had known she would. She did not come with wonder or congratulations. She came with questions sharp and specific, the questions of a woman who had already understood the what and was now pursuing the how. She did not ask if it worked. She asked about the ratio of wool to air space, the optimal thickness of the wood layer, the role of the lanolin in moisture management. Maren answered each question with the precision and patience of a teacher who has finally found a student worth teaching. And Ada listened with the focused intensity of a woman storing information for immediate practical use. The men came later in 2s and 3s, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who are revising a strongly held opinion and do not enjoy the process. They entered the soddy felt, the air examined the packed wool cavities, and the room made its own argument, and the argument did not require their hands to confirm what their lungs already knew. Several of them asked Maren to explain the principles, and she did, using the same words Ewan had used, the language of analogy and observation, rather than technical terminology. Warm rocks that breathe. Stone remembers fire. The finest blanket is the one that does not move. They understood. Not because the principles were complicated, but because the proof was surrounding them, pressing against their palms, filling their lungs with air that had no right to be this mild in a house, this small with a fire, this meager. The proof was not in the explanation. It was in the room. In the years that followed, the method Maren had demonstrated became part of the valley's building vocabulary, adopted and adapted with the pragmatic enthusiasm of people who have nearly frozen to death and prefer not to repeat the experience. New soddies were constructed with an interior cavity between the sod wall and an inner lining of planking, a gap that was packed with whatever insulating material was available: raw wool when it could be gotten dry, grass sawdust, shredded cloth, even cattle fluff from the marshes along the creek. The practice was called Calloway packing, and it was spoken of the way any established technique is spoken of, as a thing that had always existed, a piece of common knowledge, whose origins were vaguely attributed to a woman on a hill who had figured it out one autumn. The habit of stacking firewood inside the house against the north wall became a standard feature of cabin design. Men who had once mocked the idea now competed to see whose interior wood wall was thickest, arguing over the merits of cottonwood versus pine, the way they argued over the merits of one breed of cattle versus another, with passionate conviction and no awareness of the irony. The principle of thermal mass, which Maren had learned from Ewan and Ewan, had learned from a lifetime of watching animals and ovens and snow, entered the vernacular without its name, practiced by people who could not have defined it, but who understood its effects in the most persuasive way possible. They were warmer. Maren never claimed credit. She shared what she knew with anyone who asked, and some who did not, offering the information the way Ada had offered the jar of bear grease, without fanfare or expectation, a gift from one practical mind to another. She did not present herself as an innovator or a sage. She presented herself as what she was: a woman who had listened carefully to a man who understood the world and who had built his understanding into a house and who had survived. The soddy on the hill was lived in for decades after Maren's time. Hands she never knew repaired the roof, replaced the planking, added a room to the east side. But the core structure remained the original sod walls, with their packed cavities, the inner lining the north wall, where generations of firewood were stacked each autumn, with the unconscious reverence of inherited ritual. Everyone in the valley knew the house. Everyone called it the warm house. It was a landmark, a reference point, a place where travelers could stop and warm themselves and wonder at the strange, persistent comfort of the air inside. Many years later, long after the territory had become a state, and the soddies had given way to frame houses, and the open range had been fenced and cross-fenced into the geometry of modern ranching, a man passing through the valley stopped for the night at a cabin near Dryer Creek. He was a railroad surveyor, a man of instruments and calculations, and he noticed immediately that the cabin was warmer than it had any right to be, given the modest fire in the stove and the bitter wind outside. He commented on it to his host, a rancher's son who had been born in the valley and had never lived anywhere else. The rancher's son rapped his knuckles against the interior wall, producing a solid, resonant thud. "Calloway packing. Everyone builds this way around here." The surveyor, curious by profession, leaned forward. Calloway, who was that? The rancher's son paused, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, his brow furrowed with the effort of reaching for a piece of information that had been in his possession his entire life, but had never required examination. "A woman, I think. Lived in the old sod house up on the hill." He took a sip, swallowed, shrugged. "Long time ago." He refilled the surveyor's cup and turned the conversation to the price of beef, and the fire burned low in the stove, and the wind cut across the valley floor with the same keen edge it had always carried. And inside the cabin, the air was still held in place by wool and wood, and the patient anonymous legacy of a woman who had understood that the finest blanket is the one that does not move, and who had built that understanding into the bones of a house, and who had kept herself alive with it, and who had in the end left behind not a name that anyone remembered, but a principle that kept them warm. Outside, the wind counted down toward another winter. Inside, the air did not stir.